We continue now at the top of Daf Kufyud Chesam at Aleph and Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 118a. The Mishnah continues, Isha Omeris Meis. Let's say one woman says that the husband died. The Isha Omeris Lo Meis, and another woman says the husband did not die. Harezu Lo Tinase. Again, the woman is not allowed to remarry. And this is a continuation. The Mishnah just said before as well, that if one aide says the husband died, and one aide says the husband did not die, again, that case as well, Harezu Lo Tinase, she's not allowed to remarry because you have a contradiction in terms of whether he died or not. Rashi over here says, Isha amra meis, Visha amra lo meis, harezu lo tinase. One woman says he died, one woman says he did not die, she cannot remarry. The key over here is, and this is true in the entire Mishnah, the case is that the second one is coming before we ever gave her a heter through the first one. Had we given her a heter already through the first one, so that was dealt with in the previous Mishnah. But here we're talking about cases where they come one right after the other. And Rashi points out, now this case at the end, when it talks about one woman saying he died and one woman saying he didn't die, that's even if you're talking about co-wives. One wife says that her husband died, and the co-wife says that the husband did not die. And so that would actually seem to contradict the first part of the Mishnah, because the first part of the Mishnah said that if one wife says he died, that woman is allowed to remarry. And so Rashi points out, we're going to see in the Gemara that the Gemara is going to say this end of the Mishnah is following Rabbi Meir's Shita. Rabbi Meir actually disagrees with the first line of the Mishnah, according to one approach in our Gemara coming up. Because Rabbi Meir's opinion is that a co-wife is able to contradict, one co-wife can contradict the other, and therefore that co-wife that said that he died is not going to be allowed to remarry. And the Gemara says, Taima de Amra lo meis. The reason is because the co-wife said he didn't die. This is going on the first case in the Mishnah. First case in the Mishnah was one wife says he died and one wife says he did not die. So the one that said he did not die is not allowed to remarry only because apparently she said he did not die. Ha'ishtaka, but let's say that wife would be quiet. She wouldn't say anything. Tinase, it sounds like the Mishnah is saying that she could get remarried on the basis of the other wife who says he died. But that doesn't make sense. Ha'ein sara mi'ido lechaverta. The rule is one co-wife cannot testify for the other co-wife. If one wife says her husband died, that does not allow her co-wife to remarry. And so the Gemara answers, Lo mesit strichale. No, it's actually the other way. The Mishnah specifically wants to have a case where that second wife says he did not die. There you actually would think there might be even more reason why that wife would be allowed to get remarried, even though she's saying he did not die. Why? Because we might have thought as follows. Ha-mayis, really, this guy really did die. And the reason why this wife is saying he didn't die, now why is she even coming in for? She's only coming in to try to mess up her co-wife. And she's just saying, let me die along with the plishtim. In other words, whatever damage I can do to my co-wife, I don't care what happens to me. And maybe that would actually be more reason to believe he has died, and that even the co-wife who says he didn't die should be allowed to remarry. So Kamash Malan, so that's why the Mishnah is teaching us, no, when she says he didn't die, she is not allowed to remarry. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Achas Omeres Meis V'chulu. It said, let's say you had a case where one of the wives says he died and the other one says he was killed. So there, Rabbi Meir says it's actually considered a contradiction, and neither of them are allowed to remarry. And so the Gemara asks, V'liflog Rabbi Meir Bereisha. Well, if that's the case, why doesn't Rabbi Meir argue in the first case of the Mishnah? When one wife says he died, one wife says he didn't die, we should call that a contradiction, and we should say that neither of them are allowed to remarry. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar says, you're actually right, but machlokas shenuya. That first line in the Mishnah is a machlokas. For Rabbi Yehuda, for Rabbi Shimon here, and that line is only authored by Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. In other words, there's a general machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir says that when it comes to a contradiction, any kind of contradiction between the co-wives, neither of them can remarry, and Rabbi Meir would not agree with the first line of the Mishnah. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, they're the ones saying the first line of the Mishnah, and they say that in such a situation, just like if one wife says he died and one wife says he was killed, that's not considered a contradiction, and they're both allowed to remarry. So too in a case where one wife says he died and one wife says he did not die, the one who says he died is in fact allowed to remarry. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan says no. Afilu teima Rabbi Meir. You can even say that the first line of the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. Afilu Rabbi Meir moda. In this case of the first line of the Mishnah, even Rabbi Meir would admit that the woman who says he died is allowed to remarry. Dechol lo meis be'edus isha lav hachashi. Because when you have a situation of somebody saying he didn't die by edus isha, that's not considered a valid contradiction. Rashi over here says lo meis lav hachashi d'rabbanan hemnu alakama. The Rabbanan in general, they believe the first one who says that he died and the one who says he did not die is irrelevant, even according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir only says it's considered a contradiction in a case where one says he died and one says he was killed, but otherwise, if it's lo meis, that's not called a hachasha. And so the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned at the end of the Mishnah, Eid Omer Meis, Ve'ed Omer Lo Meis. That was the case where one aid says he died and one aid says he did not die. Again, this is all, there was never a heter for her to remarry. Before we even gave her a heter, the second aid comes in and says that he did not die. Or Isha Omeres Meis, Ve'isha Omeres Lo Meis. If a woman says he died and a woman says he did not die, and as Rashi points out again, Ve'isha Omeres Lo Meis, Afilu Tzaras V'mashma. That's even talking about a co-wife situation. It says a situation where the co-wife says he didn't die, harezu lo tinase. It says the woman, even the woman who says that he died, is not allowed to remarry. And so the Gemara says, B'shalom al Rebbe Lazar. I understand according to Rebbe Lazar that the first part of the Mishnah is a machlokas tanoim, and the first part of the Mishnah is only the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. So stomach Rabbi Meir. So this Mishnah at the end doesn't say who it is. It's following Rabbi Meir. In other words, the end of the Mishnah and the beginning of the Mishnah do contradict each other because they're different tanoim. In the beginning of the Mishnah, it says if one wife says he died, one wife says he did not die, the wife who says he died is allowed to remarry. That's following the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. And the end of the Mishnah, that's following Rabbi Meir, that if one wife says he died and one wife says he did not die, so that's considered a contradiction, and the first wife is not allowed to remarry. Elo Rabbi Yochanan kasha, but according to Rabbi Yochanan says that everybody agrees in a case of mace versus low mace, that the one who says mace is allowed to remarry. So that's a kasha. What's going on at the end of the Mishnah over here? The end of the Mishnah seems to be according to nobody, because everybody should agree that low mace by Eidos Isha is not considered hachasha. And the Gemara says kasha, indeed, the last line of the Mishnah is indeed difficult according to Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ha'isha shaholcha hiu ba'al l'medinas hayam. Let's say a woman and her husband, they travel in Medinas Hayam, they travel far away. Uba v'yamra, then she comes back and she says, Meis Bali, my husband died. So Tinase, she's allowed to get remarried on the basis of her own testimony. V'tital ksubas, and she can also take her ksuba money. V'tzarasa asura, but like we said before, her co-wife is asur on the basis of her testimony. That does not allow her co-wife to remarry. Haisa Bas Yisrael Kohen, and the Mishnah says, let's say this co-wife was a Bas Yisrael and she was married to a Kohen. She's Tochal B'Truma, she's allowed to continue eating Truma. We can assume that she's still married. We can assume that this husband did not die as far as the co-wife, and she can continue to eat Truma. Divrei Rabbi Tarfon, that's the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Akiva says, Ein zu derech motziasu midei avera. This is not the way to save her from avera. In other words, we don't know for sure that he did not die. Maybe he did die and she can't have Truma. Ad shetei asur linase, rather she's prohibited to remarry because maybe he did not die. V'asur milachal b'truma, but she's also prohibited to have Truma because maybe he did die. And the Mishnah continues, Amra meis bali v'yachakach meis chami. Let's say she says, my husband died, and then after that, my father-in-law died. So tinase v'titol ksubasa. So again, she can remarry on the basis of her own testimony, and she can take her ksuba. V'chamosa asura, but her mother-in-law is going to be prohibited, because as we said before, she's not believed regarding her mother-in-law, and therefore her mother-in-law is not allowed to remarry. Haisa Bas Yisrael a Kohen. Now let's say her mother-in-law was a Bas Yisrael and she was married to a Kohen. Tochal b'truma divrei Rabbi Tarfon. Again, Rabbi Tarfon says she can continue to eat truma because we can assume that her husband is alive. Rabbi Akiva says, Ein zu derech motzia midei avera. This is not the way to save her from avera. Ad shetei asur linasi. Again, she has to be both prohibited to remarry. She has to assume her husband is still alive in that regard. V'asura milachal b'truma, but she's prohibited to eat truma because in that regard, as far as truma is concerned, she has to assume that her husband is not alive. And the Gemara says, Utzrichan, we need both cases in the Mishnah. Both cases in the Mishnah seem to be identical machlokas between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Why do we need both? We need them both. Because let's say we only had the first case where she comes back and she says, my husband died, and so then we're talking about the status of the co-wife. So B'hag Kam Rabbi Tarfon, there Rabbi Tarfon says, meaning there Rabbi Tarfon says that the co-wife is allowed to continue to eat truma and can assume that her husband is alive, Mishum Detzara Degufa, because there we really assume for sure this woman is lying about the fact that her husband died because she's in pain herself from her co-wife. One co-wife causes pain to the other co-wife because they are co-wives, one is not with the husband as much as she wants to be, and therefore we assume 100% in this case the woman who's saying her husband died is actually lying in order to mess up her co-wife, and that's why she can continue eating truma. Aval chamosa, but when it comes to a situation of her mother-in-law, that Sarah mili dialma, there it's not the same level of pain. You're not preventing, the mother-in-law is not preventing her from being with her husband. It's just the pain of words, so to speak. So there, Ema Modi Leila Rabbi Akiva. There I would say maybe Rabbi Tarfon agrees with Rabbi Akiva that there is indeed a possibility that this person really died, the father-in-law really died, and therefore she should not be allowed to have truma. V'yitmar b'ha, and the Gemara says the same the other way around. If you only had this case, b'ha kama Rabbi Akiva, I would say that in this case Rabbi Akiva says what he says. In other words, Rabbi Akiva says in this particular case that she's not allowed to have truma because she has to assume that maybe her husband died by the mother-in-law. There you have to assume that maybe it's true. But in that case, in the first case, where there are co-wives, so there Rabbi Tarfon says that she's allowed to have truma. She should assume for sure this was a lie and her husband is still alive. And maybe Rabbi Akiva would admit there also for sure the husband is still alive, and this other co-wife, the only reason the wife said that the husband died was just to mess her up, we don't believe, and so therefore tzricha, that's why we need both cases. And Rashi over here explains again, Sarah Degufa, in the case where they're co-wives, that's a real pain one to the other. Tashmish monas lamibala, one co-wife prevents the other from being with her husband. Havada meshakra, so there we say, yeah, for sure it's certainly a lie. Kedei lakalkala shatinase, she's just trying to mess her up. Ve'afilu she'inis is now, even though she's messing herself up also, Tamas Nafshim Plishtim, again, it's a situation of let me die together with the Plishtim, as long as I'm causing her pain, I don't care. So in that case, you would say there it makes sense to assume that the woman is lying and to assume that the husband is still alive and that the person can continue having truma. Mo delay the Rabbi Akiva, but then you would say that in the other case of the mother-in-law, he would admit to Rabbi Akiva. Because by the mother-in-law case, you're not going to say that she's such a liar. Granted, you're not going to allow the mother-in-law to remarry. But when it comes to truma, so over there at least you should have some suspicion that the husband really did die, and you would not allow the mother-in-law to have truma. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Halacha Rabbi Tarfon. The halacha is like Rabbi Tarfon, that the woman is allowed to continue eating truma. We don't care at all what her co-wife says. We pay no attention. We assume the husband is alive and she can eat truma. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya. Abaya says, Afanon nami tanina. We learn the same thing. It says, Nitan li bein b'medinas hayam. Let's say a woman says that we went on a trip and I had a child when I was on that trip, but then Meis Bani, my son, died first, and then my husband died. In other words, she's saying still at the end of the day that she has to do yibum nemenes, so she's believed. The reason why she's believed is because she had no child when she left, and she's not changing her status of requiring yibum with her statement now. She's saying her husband died. The fact that she says I had a son is irrelevant because she says I had a son and the son died first, and so therefore she's believed and she's going to have to do yibum. Now Bali v'achakach b'ni. Now let's say she says no, my husband died first and then my son died. So in that situation, she's really saying she no longer has to do yibum. Now she's believed to say that her husband died, but she's not necessarily believed to say that she had a child and she gets out of yibum. So in that case, eino nemenes, she's not going to be believed. V'choshin l'dvareh, we are concerned with what she has said. V'choled says v'lo mes yavemes, and she does chalitza and she does not do yibum. We'll take a look at Rashi over here. Nitin li bein isha sheholchem ba'al l'medinas hayam. Again, she goes on a trip. When she left, she had no child. The assumption was she has to do yibum. Now she comes and she says, I had a child while I was on the trip. And she says, my son died first and then my husband died. So she never took herself out of the original presumption that she needs to do yibum if her husband dies. So she's going to need to do yibum. She's believed. And indeed, she's going to be allowed to do yibum. However, if she tries to take herself out of yibum, she's not going to be believed. She can't just go and get remarried without chalitza. The Rabbanan only believe her about her husband that he died. The daiko mitzvah, she's very careful that he died. She makes sure first before she remarries. But to take herself out from having to marry the brother-in-law, they don't believe her in that regard. Maybe she hates the yavam, and so she's making up this whole fact that she had a child. And so therefore we say that she has to do chalitza. Now the language over there was that we're gonna suspect what she's saying, we're gonna be concerned, right? We're concerned with her words, and she has to do chalitza, but she's not allowed to do yibum. And so the Gemara makes the following inference. We're concerned with what she says, but we're not concerned with what one co-wife says about the other. In other words, when one co-wife says the husband died, so with regards to the other co-wife, we have no concern that the husband died, and that's why she's even allowed to have truma, like Rabbi Tarfon said, Shema Minot. And so again, you see from this Mishnah that we hold like Rabbi Tarfon, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis.